The doors had been locked for decades, yet the air inside still carried the faint, powdery scent of laundry soap. Rows of narrow iron beds stood in two perfect lines, their blankets smoothed as if waiting for small hands to pull them back. A pale shaft of light spilled through a cracked window, landing on a pillow that still bore the faint indentation of a child's head. I first heard about the old St. Bridget's orphanage from a man named Thomas Greer, a retired postman who claimed he once delivered letters there. Letters no one ever answered. His voice had the kind of weight that made you lean in, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something that still lingered. It wasn't just the building's age that drew me here, it was the stories, half-whispered, half-forgotten, about a night when the children vanished. No footprints in the snow, no sounds in the halls. Only beds tucked in with care as if the little ones had stepped out for a moment and never came back. Standing there now, my footsteps echoing off the walls, I felt as though the air itself was holding its breath. Somewhere between the dust and silence, I could almost hear the laughter that once filled this room. And I couldn't shake the question that had brought me all this way: what happened here and why has no one spoken of it since? Thomas had met me at the gate that morning, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a worn wool coat. He didn't say much at first, just nodded toward the path, letting me follow the crunch of gravel under our boots. The orphanage loomed ahead, its brick walls scarred with weather, ivy clinging like stubborn memories. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped, and the air grew heavy with that peculiar stillness old places hold. Thomas's eyes moved over the walls as if reading words that had long since faded. "They were good kids," he murmured. "Never caused trouble except maybe on Sundays after supper." There was a faint smile in his voice, but it didn't last. He led me down a hallway lined with framed photographs, sepia-toned faces of children standing in neat rows, the smallest ones clutching the hems of all. Dear one's coats, some smiled, some didn't. "That one there," Thomas said, pointing to a boy with wide eyes and a crooked collar, his name was Daniel. Bright as they came, gone just like the rest. The corridor ended at a heavy wooden door. Its brass handle was cold under my palm, and when I pushed it open, the hinges groaned like something reluctant to let go. Inside was the dormitory I'd seen in old newspaper clippings, beds lined up in unbroken order, blankets smooth, pillows waiting. Thomas didn't step inside, he lingered in the doorway, watching me. "It's been this way since that night," he said. "No one's touched a thing." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Sometimes I think they might still be here, just not where we can see them." The air inside the dormitory felt different, thicker somehow, as though it held the weight of every night that had passed without them. I walked slowly between the beds, my fingers grazing the cool iron frames. Each one was perfectly made, the corners of the blankets tucked tight with a precision that didn't belong to abandonment. A small stuffed rabbit sat at the foot of one bed, its fur worn to a dull gray, one ear slumped as if it had been waiting too long. On the far wall, a window was propped open just an inch, letting in a faint current of air. Dust swirled lazily in the light, catching on motes before drifting back into shadow. I bent down to pick up something from the floor, a child's shoe scuffed at the toes, the laces tied in a neat bow. It was as if its owner had been about to put it on, then thought better of it. From the doorway, Thomas spoke again, his voice carrying that uneasy mix of memory and fear. "They searched everywhere," he said. "Every inch of this place, the grounds, the woods behind the hill, not a trace, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just gone." He hesitated, then added, "Some folks said it was the storm that night, others had different ideas." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes kept me silent. He wasn't just recalling a story, he was guarding it. And in that moment, I understood this was more than a mystery to him. It was a wound that had never healed, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to pull the thread. Later that afternoon, the light outside began to fade, and the long shadows in the hall stretched toward the dormitory like reaching fingers. Thomas had stepped outside to smoke, leaving me alone with the stillness. I wandered toward a narrow staircase at the end of the corridor, one I hadn't noticed before. Its steps were steep, the wood worn down in the center from countless small feet. At the top was a small attic room, its ceiling sloped low and lined with shelves. Dust lay thick over everything, but the space didn't feel entirely forgotten. On one shelf I found a row of tin lunchboxes, each with a name scratched into the paint: Lucy, Ben, Clara, Peter. The paint was chipped, but the letters were still clear, as if whoever had written them wanted to be remembered. I opened one at random. Inside were bits of folded paper, a broken crayon, and a pressed flower that had long since turned brittle. Another lunchbox held a postcard of a seaside town, the handwriting on the back in a child's uneven scrawl: "When I grow up, I'll go here." It was signed simply EA. Floorboard creaked behind me. I turned, expecting Thomas, but the doorway was empty. Only the faint draft from the staircase stirred the air. For a moment I thought I heard the whisper of small voices, like children conspiring under their breath, but when I strained to listen, it was gone. I closed the lunchbox gently, almost afraid of disturbing whatever lingered here. Something told me these objects weren't just keepsakes, they were the last traces of lives that had been carefully folded away, just like the bed's Tao. Downstairs, when Thomas returned, he found me sitting on the attic floor, the lunchboxes lined up beside me like a silent roll call. He glanced at them but didn't step closer, as though crossing into that space might stir something best left alone. "You found their things," he said quietly, the words more observation than question. I asked him about the names, about the children who once carried these lunchboxes. He took a long breath before answering. Some of them came from far away: Boston, Chicago, places their parents couldn't keep them. Others were local, dropped off at the gate with nothing but a coat too big for their shoulders. They had each other, though. That was the only constant. His gaze lingered on the lunchbox marked Clara. She was the youngest, barely 5. She used to hum when she was scared. I can still hear it sometimes. We descended the stairs together, the floorboards sighing under our weight. Back in the dormitory, the fading daylight had turned the room the color of old photographs. The shadows between the beds seemed deeper now, almost watchful. Thomas stopped in the doorway again, his posture tense. "I don't stay here after dark," he said. "No one does." I wanted to press him, to ask why, to demand the truth, but something in his voice made me hold back. It wasn't fear alone, it was the kind of wariness that comes from living alongside a secret for too many years. As we left the room, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The beds were still perfectly made, the stuffed rabbit still waiting. But for the first time since I'd arrived, I had the unsettling sense that something or someone was aware I had been there. That night I stayed in a small inn on the edge of town, but the orphanage refused to leave my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the beds, the lunchboxes, the dust drifting in the attic light. Sometime after midnight I woke to the faintest sound, a soft, rhythmic hum. It was so quiet I thought at first it was part of a dream, but it grew clearer, almost delicate, like a child's lullaby. In the morning I went back to see Thomas, finding him in the diner where the coffee was always burnt and the eggs overcooked. He seemed unsurprised when I slid into the booth across from him. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked, not even looking up from his plate. I didn't answer right away, but the silence between us was enough. He told me about Margaret Doyle, a woman who had worked at the orphanage in its final years. She'd been a cook, a strict but kind presence, and the children trusted her. After the disappearance, Margaret swore she still heard them at night, the shuffle of little feet, the hum of Clara's tune, until the day she died. Thomas leaned in, his voice low. "Some say Margaret knew more than she let on, that she saw something or someone that night." I asked where Margaret had lived, and he scribbled an address on a napkin. "It's out by the marsh," he said. "House has been empty since she passed, but if you're looking for ghosts, that's as good a place as any." I folded the napkin into my pocket, feeling the weight of it like a key I wasn't sure I wanted to use. Something told me that whatever waited out there by the marsh might finally give me answers, but they might not be the kind I wanted. The road to Margaret Doyle's house wound through a stretch of marshland that seemed to swallow sound. Even the wind moved differently out there, slow, deliberate, sliding across the tall reeds in soft whispers. Her home sat on a slight rise, a weathered clapboard structure with shutters hanging crooked and paint peeled to bare wood. The front gate leaned on rusted hinges, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale but not abandoned. Dust coated the furniture in a thin veil, yet the kitchen table still held a chipped mug and a folded dish towel, as if Margaret had simply stepped tea and never returned. I walked through each room, careful not to disturb more than necessary. In the back hallway, I found a small chest of drawers, its surface covered with framed photographs, most of them children I recognized from the Orphanage. Portraits. One photo in particular caught my eye. Clara, smiling wide, stood with a boy I hadn't seen before. He was older, maybe 13, and his arm was draped protectively over her shoulder. On the back of the photo, in Margaret's looping script, were just 2 words, "Safe now in the bedroom." A notebook lay open on the nightstand. The handwriting inside was shaky, uneven. Some pages were lists, groceries, cleaning, chores, but others read like fragments of confession. Storm coming. Heard them again, told them to hide. If they knock, don't answer. The final entry stopped mid-sentence, as though the pen had been dropped in haste. A faint sound drew my attention to the window, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails on glass. But when I looked out, there was nothing but the marsh, the reeds bending under a wind I could not feel. I stood there a moment longer, the unease settling deep in my bones. Margaret had been afraid, not of the children, but of something else entirely. I stayed in Margaret's house longer than I intended, drawn deeper into the quiet as if the walls themselves wanted me to listen. In a narrow pantry off the kitchen, I found something strange. An old wooden door set into the floor, its handle worn smooth by years of use. It was small, barely wide enough for a person to fit through, and when I pulled it open, the smell of damp earth rose up to meet me. A ladder led down into darkness. I hesitated, but curiosity pulled harder than caution. My boots touched the packed soil of a low cellar, the air cold and close. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of preserves gone cloudy with age. In the far corner, a row of small chairs sat neatly side by side, each with a blanket folded across the seat. They were child-sized. On the floor beside them lay a cardboard box filled with shoes, tiny, scuffed, and mismatched, as though collected over time. I picked up one pair, their soles worn thin, and felt an unexpected weight in my chest. These weren't just forgotten belongings. Someone had put them here deliberately, keeping them safe or hidden. A faint rustle came from somewhere in the dark, too steady to be a rat. I turned slowly, my eyes straining to adjust, but the shadows only pressed closer. Then, from just beyond the reach of the dim light filtering through the hatch, came a sound that froze me in place, a low, measured breathing like Soam. Trying not to be heard, I backed toward the ladder, my hand gripping the rungs before my mind caught up with my body. By the time I pulled the hatch closed above me, my pulse was racing. Whatever had been down there hadn't followed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been aware of me the moment I stepped inside. By the time I stepped back into the gray afternoon light, the marsh seemed heavier, the air thick enough to taste. I walked quickly down the narrow path toward town, but my mind stayed behind, circling the cellar, the rows of tiny chairs, the sound of that breath in. In the dark, I didn't tell Thomas what I had found, at least not right away. Instead, I watched him from across the diner that evening, the way his eyes moved over the room, never lingering too long on one place. When I finally approached his booth, he didn't greet me, just pushed his coffee aside and said, "You went there." It wasn't a question. I sat down, unsure how much to admit. He leaned in, his voice low enough for only me to hear. Margaret, she wasn't hiding from them. She was hiding them, and whatever she was hiding them from, it's still out there. I asked what he meant, but he shook his head. Some things you can't explain without sounding crazy, better you don't go back. Yet his warning had the opposite effect. Every part of me wanted answers, and I knew I wouldn't find them in the safety of the diner. That night back at the inn, I spread Margaret's photographs across the bed. My eyes kept going to the picture of Clara with the older boy. Something about his expression, a mix of defiance and fear, made me think he knew more than anyone had ever told. On the back, beneath Margaret's handwriting, I noticed something I hadn't before: faint pencil marks almost rubbed away. They formed a set of numbers, coordinates. I stared at them, feeling the weight of decision settle on me. If I followed them, I might finally understand what happened the night the children vanished. Or I might find exactly what Margaret had been trying to keep away from the world. The coordinates led me deep into the marsh, farther than any road or trail was meant to go. The ground grew soft beneath my boots, each step pulling me down into the cold, damp earth. The reeds closed in overhead, their dry stalks rattling in the wind like 1,000 tiny bones. By the time I reached the spot, the sun had slipped low, casting the landscape in the kind of fading light that makes shadows seem alive. At first there was nothing, just water pooled in uneven patches and the smell of mud thick in the air. Then I saw it, a structure half buried in the reeds. It wasn't much more than a shack, its roof sagging, the wood gray and swollen from years of storms. I pushed the door open, and the hinges gave a long, aching groan. Inside, the air was cool, and the walls were lined with shelves stacked with jars, tin cups, and folded blankets. In the center of the room sat a long table, and on it, a row of small, leather-bound books. I opened one at random. Inside were lists of names, each with a date beside it. Most were from decades ago, but the last page stopped me cold, the ink still sharp and dark. It held only 3 names: Clara, Daniel, and one I didn't recognize. The date beside them was the night they disappeared. A sound came from behind me, a soft shuffle like bare feet on wood. I turned quickly, but the doorway was empty. Still, I felt it, that same awareness I'd felt in the dormitory. I was not alone. I left the shack without taking anything, but as I stepped back into the marsh, the wind carried something faint but unmistakable. The hum of a child's tune, drifting between the reeds, growing softer the farther I walked. When I finally reached solid ground, the last of the light was gone. I knew I had found a piece of the truth, but whatever had taken the children, whatever Margaret had feared, it was still here. And it knew I was looking. I left town the next morning, the orphanage shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a silhouette against the pale sky. But even miles away, it followed me: the creak of the dormitory door, the smell of dust in Margaret's attic, the faint hum in the marsh. I hadn't solved the mystery, not really. I'd only peeled back enough layers to see how deep it went and how many people had chosen to let it rest. Some part of me understands why. There are truths that don't bring closure, only more questions, more shadows. And yet, I can't stop wondering whose voices I heard in that house, whose eyes might still watch from the edges of the marsh. If you've ever heard whispers about St. Bridget's, if your family has a story, a rumor, a name you've never asked about, tell me, share it. Because maybe the only way to bring the children home, even after all these years, is to piece their story together one fragment at a time. And if you think this is the kind of mystery that should stay buried, ask yourself why.